Welcome to this episode of the Account & Coke Report. Today we have the pleasure of having Damian Carabello. Damian is an emergency physician in Tampa, Florida. He's involved in advocacy work, and he's also vice president of the College of Emergency Medicine in Florida as well. Damian, from following him on Twitter, has just a wealth of knowledge of the topic that he's on here to discuss today, which touches on surprise billing. That's the thing that's in the news the most. But as we'll see, that rabbit hole kind of goes on in an endless fashion. And Damian's done really an amazing job in terms of trying to follow the threads to see where does they lead. So Damian, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Anish. Appreciate it.
Damian, so tell me how, I'll start by saying that, the thing that gets the most attention and gets a lot of negative press, certainly for physicians, the thing that we have to constantly battle is the issue of surprise billing, right? Surprise billing is where somebody will show up usually at a hospital in some sort of an emergency fashion. And even though the hospital may be, within the network of their insurance company, it's possible that there are groups or physicians that are that are working in the hospital that may not be participating in the patient's insurance plan, which then generates these bills. And the bills, of course, because they're kind of unfiltered, there's no negotiation. There's basically the list price bill is then sent to the physician, resulting in a lot of consternation and a lot of accusations of kind of taking advantage of patients when they're in extremis. Is that the kind of the narrative that you find yourself battling all the time?
Yeah, so surprise billing was a term that actually came up. It was in Zach Cooper, who's an economist out of Yale, came up with the term surprise billing. It actually used to be called balance billing. And it came up, the reason they use surprise is because there's this concept that there's this, the majority of physicians are actually not employed by the hospital. The majority of physicians work for independent groups. And especially in what we call the pair physicians, which are pathologists, emergency medicine, anesthesia, and radiologists. The majority of those do not work for hospitals. They're contracted out based on groups. Some are not large national groups. The group I happen to work for now happens to be a local group. We have about 100 providers in our group, and we're all from Tampa. So it can go anywhere, from groups of like 20, 30 people to, national groups with over, thousands of physicians. So it used to be, in emergency physician, I can talk for emergency physician, but it's pretty similar with the anesthesia and radiology and pretty much any hospital-based physician. If you have an emergency, you don't have time to go and network with every single insurance. And especially where we work in Florida, what people don't realize is you can have Blue Cross Blue Shield, and they could have 50 different plans just in Florida, let alone across the country. And Blue Cross Blue Shield in Florida is different than Blue Cross Blue Shield in Michigan or in Pennsylvania. And the national one's actually different. It's another thing called ERISA. So there's pretty much no group in America can contract with every single insurer. So what happens is you're out of network with some of these groups. And what it used to be is we would bill the patient. And if you're out of network, those tend to be, when you're in network, it usually favors the insurer because it's the insurer's doing it so you can get quick payment. And usually the hospital wants you to be in network. When you're out of network, there's some negotiation. So you go back and forth with the insurer and see you bill them something, say you bill $500, the insurer comes back and says, we're gonna pay you $100. It kind of negotiates back and forth. And the goal is to keep the patient out of it. But in the 2000s, we started seeing that, it used to be you do it and they have a max allowable and they pay you that much. But in the 2000s, interesting enough, United Health Group really was one that led with this. And they're now the biggest insurer in the world, actually. They started having a database where they would collect all the groups in, say all the emergency groups in America. They had a database and they go, this is what they average collect when they're in network, when they're out of network. They started reimbursing based on that. And what happens is, depending on what state you're in, the majority of states, you used to be able to give the remainder of the balance to the patient. That was called a balance bill because it was the balance of what's paid. And what's happening is some groups did take advantage of this, especially the national groups, found that, it could do this and it could drive up some of your in-network rates. So they use that kind of as a negotiation against the insurers who are obviously United makes 225 billion a year. It's the sixth biggest corporation in America. They're obviously going to have leverage when it comes to negotiating. But what we started seeing is that insurers actually took advantage of this. And they actually took advantage of the database that collected, what a average in-network rate. They manipulated it. And that was called the Ingenix scandal from New York. And interesting enough, it involves a lot of people who are famous now.
Yeah. So just to break it down just a little bit, you used to have this negotiation used to take place. That's where the patient was left out of it. No one wants the patient involved in any of these things. But then what's ended up happening is that the insurance companies, I guess, have realized that it may be an effective long-term strategy to basically, say, okay, we're not paying, and kind of putting the patient in the middle. So that ends up, of course, leaving the patient on the hook for these large bills. Are you saying was that a legislative change that resulted in that, or why did that suddenly start happening?
What's interesting, so what happened is it was a few things. First off, you had to have, think about 20 years ago, there was a lot, in your community, I'm sure Philadelphia, there was probably hundreds of different hospital systems.
Yeah.
When we start seeing in the 2000s, especially with the ACA, we start seeing a lot of consolidation.
Right.
So it's just consolidation, you start getting major players. It wasn't just consolidation in hospitals, it was consolidations in groups, and it was consolidation in insurers. So you start getting a few big players pretty much control the market in terms of negotiations. So you start getting these big groups like United, Anthem, which was WellPoint, but Anthem kind of grew out of that. And then you start getting these big health systems. I know in Pennsylvania, you guys got UPMC, and you got some big health systems like that. A lot of the academic centers have them. Here in Florida, Advent's a big one. Where I work, Baycare is the largest one in Tampa. You see these big systems, so they have some leverage in it. So these tend to go with the insurers. If you're the only player in town, or you only have two big systems in town, they have some leverage for getting good in-network contracts. And of course, they do want an in-network contract because they want people in the community to be like, we're in your network, come to our hospital. That's what the hospitals want. But on the flip side, you have all these groups that staff the hospital, which are the physician groups. And what most people don't realize is that when you get a bill from the hospital, you get a bill from the hospital and you get a bill from the physician. And the physician bill is usually about 10 to 20% of what the hospital bill is. I know when you go to the ER, everybody complains about the $4,000 or $5,000 bill they get. But our average bill in the ER, we looked it up, and we got the average in Florida was somewhere between $250 to $500. And that often involves life-saving work for what we do. And people don't realize that with that. So we don't have the leverage. Like our group has 100 people. We don't have the leverage to go up to United and say, hey, this is what we want. This is what we bill. This is what we expect to get. They're going to laugh us out of the building. And what's happened with a lot of the groups is that the insurers went to the hospitals and they went in network because they really didn't have a choice, right? But they did have a choice with the providers at the hospital, with the physicians at the hospital, the groups. They don't have to pay them as much. And they can actually name their price for a lot of them. A lot of them are paying at Medicare rates, which I don't think people realize how low Medicare rates are for a lot of the things. As an emergency physician, if I do a life-saving level 5 chart and I save somebody's life, I get reimbursed $170 by Medicare. It costs more to get a plumber to your house, and people don't realize that. That's what we're getting paid, and that's what we're negotiating over. But what's interesting around the 2000s, you saw a lot of these insurers shifted to this rule. It was actually pretty shrewd on their part. They started shifting this PR kind of battle where they started saying, hey, look, at these doctors are charging 3, 4, 5 times Medicare rates for emergency medicine. They're going out of network and charging 4 times Medicare rates. Well, 4 times Medicare rates is less than $800, but it sounds really bad if you say 4 times Medicare rates. So they got this kind of like good PR strategy going. And then we did have some bad players. Some of the groups would come in and take over in some rural places that they basically took over the staffing for rural places. There were some large, and they exploited it a little bit because they could raise the price and they could actually staff the place better with physicians because they could pay the physicians higher because they were getting higher out-of-network rates. So what they would do is they would go in and they go, we're not going to pay this in-network rate. We're going to go out-of-network. And they actually got higher reimbursement for that, especially in rural areas. So if you're arguing strictly from, say, like a capitalist or laissez-faire argument, you could argue that the hospital had trouble staffing those ERs because they were paying too low to their physicians. And when these bigger groups came in, it was actually more the market rate that they were getting. Instead, what insurers are very shrewd and have good PR people. They flipped it around and said, look, these groups are purposely going out of network to make more money, and they're really hosing it to the patients. And this was in conjunction with the shift to high deductible plans. So I remember my dad worked for the government, he worked for FAA, and he had a great government plan where basically they would pay everything. I think he had to pay like 20% or 10%. That's all he ever paid. Well, now it's like you're talking about, if you have a family, my family, it's $8,000. You're paying every single percent of that $8,000 to hit deductible. Then you have a co-insurance. You're paying 20% after that. The deductibles used to be like $500. So there's been a big shift in that. And interestingly, not surprisingly, you've seen insurance's stock value just skyrocket.
Yeah.
This has happened.
Right. Well, I mean, with those high deductibles, the insurance premiums have just gone way down, right? I'm joking. Yeah. So, they've shifted all these costs.
I have it. Since the ACA took over, since about 2010, deductibles have grown 212%, premiums have grown 55%. And in 2018, which is the date I had, the average family plan costs the employer about $19,600, while an individual plan costs about $7,000.
See, Damian, yeah, all that money going right in the doctor's pockets.
Yeah, right now, we're the reason insurance.
We're the reason why
the costs are high, right?
So hilarious. But all right, so this happens, and then of course there's these cases, and the reporters and journalists that and they mean well because obviously you're in the ER with some terrible thing. You have insurance, you're paying your premiums, and you get stuck with this gigantic bill. You've nicely laid out the fact that, of course, a very small percentage of that is going to be the physician bill. But regardless, you end up with this large bill, and you get very sympathetic coverage for that. And then you have folks that have solutions, right? And the solutions, which unfortunately the left and the right seem to both are as one on this, is that they really want to control the price of healthcare that's delivered. So, and they both have just different ways of doing it, but ultimately, basically, they would like some type of price ceiling, price control, right? So that you cannot there's no, if your hospital is in network, you have insurance, and you go and you get emergency care from an anesthesiologist, a ER doctor, a trauma surgeon, etc., that rate is going to be preset, correct? So that's one solution.
So right now, we have some different solutions and different ways of thinking how to end balance billing or surprise billing, and that's the one you're referring to is what's called benchmarking. And basically, it's a really sweet deal if you're an insurer, because a benchmark is basically if you're out of network. And first off, I do got a caveat. There's no such thing as unless every employee at a hospital is employed by that hospital, there's no such thing as an in-network hospital. So this is another, and this is part of the PR game that they played very well. It's pretty impressive. It should probably be studied in marketing. They say this is an in-network hospital, but then none of the physicians are actually in network at the hospital because they don't have to negotiate with small groups. They can do whatever they want. It's take it or leave it. So what they've come up with is if you go to one of these quote unquote in-network hospitals, which really aren't because they're not fairly negotiating with physicians, they say we're going to do a benchmark rate, which is basically, you ask them what it is, it's our in-network rate, which is the same rate that when they went to the physicians that were staffing that hospital weren't willing to take because it was too low. So basically, it gives the companies like United, which is the sixth largest company in the United States, complete leverage over groups like ours, which is like 100 people, as if they didn't have leverage already, right? So, and that's what the benchmark is. It's based on an in-network rate, and And so what we're worried about is not only is it in-network rate, they set their in-network rates. And they want to, they come up with these proprietary formulas, which are just basically based on Medicare, which, as we talked about, is really low.
So the benchmark solutions, basically, it involves, so it's basically a median in-network price. So that physicians are mandated to charge if they're out of network, right? So if you have the current distribution of negotiated in-network rates that goes from, here to here or whatnot, say, whatever, $300 to $800, what insurers want and what there's a lot of support for is that if a patient shows up that's out of network, you're going to get the ER physician or whoever is taking it is going to get the median number. So so
on a median rate for a geographical area.
Right, exactly. So in Florida, the median in-network rate for an ER physician, the insurer and whoever will say, look, we're going to pay you the median in-network rate. So to most people that sounds pretty fair, right? Like, so can you tell me why that's not necessarily the best way to go?
Yeah, it'd kind of be the equivalent of Amazon telling its sellers how much they're going to charge for their own products, is basically what it is. But there's a few problems with it. First off, who calculates the median rate? Right? And this is where we go into conflict of interest.
Right.
Run it off with HCCI, which is an insurance funded, and insurance gives all the data for it. Right. Then you could run into the Index problem where they basically can manipulate it. So that's one problem. Another problem is, and this is baked into it, this is not by accident, is if everybody's in median rates the highest rate you can get, what's going to happen to a median rate over time? It's going to go down in an area. Nobody's going to be able to ever get higher at it.
Right.
So if you say they're getting like 300 for a patient and the median rate's 160, then everybody in that area is going to get 160 now. And then what's going to happen next time they negotiate with you, you're never going to get that 300 again. It's going to keep going down and down. And in fact, if you look at the CBO, which is what makes they show the economic impact of what would happen if this happened, benchmarking, they say it would save about $29 billion, and that's basically all paid for with a 20% price reimbursement cut to all hospital-based physicians. So if you work in a hospital, and you see patients in a hospital, and you see emergency patients, like Impala patients, which is pretty much anybody who consults in a hospital, and you're out of network, too bad. You're gonna get a cut in terms of what you get reimbursed for those patients.
Right. It's not rocket science. Meaning, if why would an insurance company, why would a payer negotiate with physicians, with a physician group, if they know that if they just don't negotiate, you're just gonna get 50% of the rate anyway, right? And so, as these contracts that they have with physician groups, expire, they're just gonna say, hey, we don't need to negotiate with you. As a physician group, what leverage do you have if you know that the ceiling is going to be 50% of the median in-network rate? It's going to be between, basically, your negotiation is going to be, well, I hope they give me 50% of the current median network rate, and as you said, that will kind of go, that'll go down with time. And then what you touched on, which is even more interesting, which is how and where these databases reside and where they're made. So you had a very nice thread about Ingenix. Can you talk a little bit about what Ingenix is?
Yeah, so Ingenix ties into, if you follow these rabbit holes, it's pretty crazy how this is all related to modern where we're at. So Ingenix was actually created by United Health Group, and United Health Group, its stock price in 2000 was about $10 per share, and then its stock price today is about $300. And basically, it grew from one of fourth or fifth biggest insurer in the country. Now it's one of the biggest ones. And it started with Ingenix. And so what they did is they had this group, this database, and it was actually run by, lo and behold, Andy Slavitt, who ended up being the head of CMS for the President Obama's administration.
Yeah, the COVID expert also.
Yeah, COVID. He's now a COVID expert, yes, all that data. Exactly. And so basically it was run by him, and it actually, this was where they manipulated the out-of-network rate, right? This is why we're concerned about HCCI, because they already did this with Index. So basically what happened is they found out this. They were basically saying, they got the average median of it, and instead of reimbursing, say, $120, they would reimburse, because you pay 20% co-insurance, right? So they would pay they pay you they say, well, the average rate's not 120, it's 80 based on our database. And they have a black box. They own the data, so you don't know how they got that number. So they say 80 is our average reimbursement rate, and we're only going to pay 80% of this, and the 20% is on the patient. And then
right, so that I don't mean sorry. I just want to emphasize this point. So when we talk about benchmarking, and you'll see back and forths between the few economists that will still talk to us or that we're not blocked by. But the economists will say, what's wrong with 50% of the median rate? And we talked about what that's going to do with time. But the other incredibly important point that you're bringing up is that the way it started out, the only person who really knows what the median rate is them, because they're the ones that have the data in terms of what's being paid. Because me as a cardiologist, I know the academic guy down the street gets paid a lot more for everything that I do, but I don't know exactly what it is. And I don't know what, the academic guy, 3 blocks down makes and all that.
Do you not know, if you got together with your friends and you started discussing,
right,
it's illegal, that's collusion.
Right.
But there's 2 groups in America that can legally collude by acts of Congress. One is Major League Baseball, and the other is insurance companies. So insurance companies can actually show each other their own data, and these guys have some of the most advanced databases in the country. So they can go back and forth and show each other's data. They know what United knows what Humana pays in network, out of network. Right. They know where everybody pays. They know better than we know what they pay.
Yeah. So when they talk about benchmarks and how 50% should be fair, it's like, guys, nope, the only person who has that data is them. Like, we don't have, the doctors who are getting paid don't have that. We just have to trust them that, hey, they're gonna do what they say they're gonna do. And hey, guess what? In Genix, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what would happen, right? Because there's such a massive amount of money at stake, right? Even if you shave off $20, right? You multiply that by the number of claims in these consolidated, there was only 5 insurers across the entire planet or whatever. That accounts to a ton of money. So in Genix, you're saying, was basically not paying the correct rate. How did they even figure that out?
I'm not sure. I think the AMA sued them, and the doctors figured out, hey, man, we were getting paid $120 a year ago, and now you're paying us $80. But here was the kicker. This is there's so many kickers on this, but insurers actually invented balance billing, because when they did this, say you were charging $200, and this was the actual Andrew Cuomo, the current governor of New York, how he became famous, because he went after United and he won. And this is how he got his name. He made his name for himself by going after United Health Group. And his own thing, he showed that the normal doctor visit would cost $200. Ingenex would claim the typical rate was $77, and they'd only pay $62 because they pay 80%, right? You have the 20% co-insurance. So the patient got stuck on the hook for $138, or the group eats the $138. You say, I'm not going to balance bill the patient. So you have your group, and you used to get paid $200 up to a couple of years ago. All of a sudden, this Ingenex comes along and go, no, we're going to pay that. We're going to pay you $62. And you can either charge the patient the rest, or you can eat it. I mean, and that's basically, and they showed that, and they were committing fraud to do this. It wasn't enough that they were paying less. They manipulated it to pay even less than what they would have paid less anyways. We call it the fox guarding the hen house kind of thing.
So in that example, Ingenex was paying $200, and then they suddenly dropped it to $62 basically.
What happened is New York wanted a database to see what's the out-of-network rate and everything like that.
Right.
So they basically got all their data together, and once they saw, this is how much we usually pay, we're going to go even less than that. They manipulated the numbers to do this. And this is one big argument we make when we go to Congress, is that you can't trust insurers for a lot of these things. I mean, I could just go on, you just Google Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud, you know, funny enough, the head of CMS, the future head of CMS, was the director who directed this. Why they defrauded New York probably hundred of million. They probably defrauded them billions of dollars.
So now they're defrauding patients, or they're right
and groups. Yeah. So depending on what happens, if you're defrauding the providers technically, and then if you get balanced billed, you're defrauding the patients, right? So if you're saying I got 200 a year ago and now you're giving me $62, where's the rest of the money? And they go, oh, it's on the patient. And as they go into high deductible, it gets even worse, right? You're not even getting 62 anymore. Suddenly the patient's paying that 62 plus the other 20% plus the rest of the bill, and it gets more and more. I equate it to like Wile E. Coyote moving or the Roadrunner moving the thing, and Wile E. Coyote runs off a cliff. That's basically what the insurers did. They removed the drape. Everybody ran off the cliff.
So, why would they be so bald-faced about it? I mean, why would they cut the rates that much and expect people not to notice?
They probably got greedy. I'm sure they did it. I don't know how quickly they cut it or what, but that's the problem when they own the black box proprietary data. They can make the rates whatever they want. And like I said, so here's another. I mean, this story is just so, if you follow it, so crazy how it ties in with.
I know it gets complicated, so just I'm going to just repeat it. Ingenix is not a healthcare company. Ingenix is a data company, right? Ingenix has data that they have accumulated from all these different places, correct?
Yeah.
And they provide their database of rates that are being paid to the insurance companies. Now, because anything goes in the land of insurance companies, and nothing antitrust, nothing applies. United Healthcare is actually bought Ingenix, so Ingenix is a subsidiary of United Health Group.
Yep.
And so Ingenix dramatically, the rates that they gave to United Healthcare, as in, well, this is what the costs are, were significantly lower. So, and basically Ingenix systematically reduced the amount of money for which consumers, basically should be reimbursed. So Cuomo files suit and ends up, and United Healthcare Group ends up settling, not for a small amount of money. This wasn't like a slap on the wrist. Well, maybe to them it's a small amount of money.
250 million. So it wasn't, it's not.
Right.
Obviously that sounds like a lot of money.
Yeah.
They'd taken 20 billion in profit last year, but it's a substantial amount of money. And then the interesting thing is they funded another 50 million was given to fund the Fair Health database, and then Anthem had to pay another 100 million to fund the Fair Health database. So what New York did, and this was smart, they said, well, we obviously, the fox can't guard the hen house, right? So we need an independent database which collects the data and publishes, this is how much the in-network rate is, this is how much the out-network rate. And we still have that. It's the best and most thorough database in the entire country. It's the Fair Health database. And actually, when New York banned their balanced billing and they came up with a solution, they use independent dispute resolution. And when we get into we want to end balanced billing, but we want to use independent resolution to do it. It's kind of like baseball star arbitration. And it uses Fair Health database as one of the data points it uses to determine what's a fair rate, right? Because they're not owned by insurances, giving the data. It's an independent group. Well, ironically enough, they funded this, United funded this. And in my state, Florida, when Florida bid to have because we have arbitration as well here, that's how we settle disputes here. It's called Maximus. When they went to fund it, Fair Health database was completely shut out of the bidding. Like, they got completely blackballed by our legislator. And basically, insurers are the top lobbying group. Them and Pharma are the two biggest lobbying groups in the country, health insurers. The insurance industry as itself is number one. They completely blackballed Fair Health from it. And lo and behold, HCCI, which we call Ingenix 2.0, basically got the bid for it. So now HCCI is the one using in Florida. And just based on the amount of data they have, it doesn't even come close to fair health. You have no idea. It's better for bundle building than it is for finding out what the actual value of it is. And what's interesting is Ingenex, they stopped it at United, right? So then it ended up being the quality software service, which was actually when Slavic took over the CMS. That's the one that got the bid to do the marketplaces for the Obamacare, the ACA thing. So this is so they got that. They gave Slavic.
I'm sorry. Who got that? Who got the bid? United got that?
United Health Group did.
Oh.
So United Health Group during the ACA, they built the whole backbone for the Obamacare plans or whatever. You know, the ACA.
So Slavitt, when he's CMS director, gives the bid to or whatever.
It was right before he became the director. They gave the bid
I see. Right.
United Health Group.
Right.
And Slavic gets named the director, and then because you can't make this up, because they don't want a conflict of interest, they let Slavic sell all his stock tax-free, no capital gains on it, that he had in United, because they didn't want him to have a conflict of interest. So he got $5 million completely tax-free because he got a special waiver from Congress. He becomes CMS director. And basically, if you look at when the ACA started and when all these insurers are now, their stock price, they've all appreciated at least 500%, with United being the top one at 900% appreciation since 2010. So it's just this, it's pretty crazy how our government rampantly lets this happen, and kind of like crony capitalism has really taken over a lot of it. I think it's on both sides, and it just shows some of the corruption that we have here in this country, unfortunately.
And what happened with is Ingenex still around, or?
So yeah, so out of the ashes of that, they came up with Optum, and actually this is actually not so much what Slavic taken over, but it was really Optum that transformed United from, in 2012 they surpassed WellPoint, which is Anthem now, as the largest company in the world. And it's basically because of this Optum, which is basically their super Ingenex, I guess you can think of it. It basically has all their data, and interestingly enough, it's the technology and services arms of United Health Group. It owns a PBM, a physician benefit manager,
pharmacy benefit
also
manager.
The largest employer of physicians in the country, which I don't think people realize that. They bought Vita, which was the largest physician group in the country, independent physician group in the country. And basically, they created their own backdoor Kaiser or HMO, I guess you can think of, by purchasing all these groups. And not only that, every insurance has what's called the MLR, which is basically it says due to the ACA that the loss ratio is that insurer can only they have to spend at least 80% of their premiums on health insurance and things that benefit the consumer. But one interesting way is that that's all their premiums, but you can skirt around that by using a PBM to do some complicated things called spread pricing and stuff like that. That's not included in the MLR. And interestingly enough, United Health Group makes 50% of its revenue on Optum, not on their insurance. So I think if you took a good look in there, and President Trump's CMS actually put some laws in it to try to decrease the advantages they were taking from that. But it's kind of like, you can think of it like a subsidiary where Apple goes to Ireland to avoid taxes, basically the same thing. They skirt the MLR by putting some revenue in this, and it enriches the insurance company.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how this stuff is kind of allowed to happen, and it's also interesting how powerless a lot of people really seem in terms of trying to go after it. Because even we had Dr. Chada and Marion Mass on to talk about the executive order and PBMs and what can happen. But it really seems like the president is limited to angrily tweeting about people, about people making too much money from the stuff, because even the executive order, if you read it carefully, it's more a suggestion. It's more like
didn't really have
some
teeth.
type of a warning shot. Yeah, it has no real teeth, unfortunately. So it's fascinating. Do you think so? Do we have? I mean, do you see the future being publicly funded databases that'll be fair? And then and this is why, again, this is why physicians, currently mired in this current system, argue that, look, a 50%, a median benchmark doesn't make sense because, so because that'll just result in lower and lower rates over time. But is the best argument, Damian, then to have a kind of a public non-insurance owned database? Maybe it doesn't have to be public. It just doesn't have to be owned. It can't be insured by the insurance company, I guess, which has an actual spread of prices, and then have a benchmark that's not 50%, but 80% to kind of, force or give some leverage to physicians in order to be able to negotiate rates with insurers. Is that?
That's actually what Connecticut did when they saw their balance billing, and that made everybody happy. It made the physicians happy, but then the insurers argued, they cried poor that, hey, paying 80th percentile, then you're actually overcharging what we pay the majority of our physicians. But I think what New York did was pretty fair with the independent dispute resolution. I've already shown that you can't trust insurers for anything.
Right.
That their job is to basically meet their shareholders and try to maximize revenue. So you do need an independent thing, but you really need some kind of recourse for small groups like our group. If the insurers start acting badly, you need to be able to go to someone and say, hey, look, this is what they're doing. They're manipulating what they're reimbursing us. And, we really need a recourse for it. So we're arguing that independent dispute resolution is the way to do that. And that in fair health can be one of the things in it, where you have an arbitrator kind of goes in, and it can weigh different things, and they can make their argument, and we can make our argument. No different than when you get Aaron Judd goes up for a contract, and he goes to the arbitrator and say, hey, look, I was the best hitter here. This is how many home runs I hit. This is how much I should be making because this is how much this guy makes. And, the Yankees can make their argument back, and that's what an arbitrator does. And that still keeps a little bit of the market in there. So, you got some back and forth, and people won't take advantage of it either way.
Yeah, it's really, so IDR, Independent Dispute Resolution, which was done in New York. They showed, it was implemented in New York in 2014, and they found that out-of-network rates, or the amount of time you were out of network, how often that a patient ended up with went from 20% in 2013 to 6% in 2015. So, the issue is that, that kind of forces people to the table. And then if you do have, if you do have a case where somebody's coming in where they're out of network, et cetera, then you do have this kind of arbitrator that can decide between the two. A third party can decide what a rate should be between the two folks. Does that seem to be? Well, I should ask, I guess, why do economists, and we've had lots of discussions with economists, why are they so against the IDR? Why are they so attached to, benchmarking, and certainly median benchmarking? That seems to be the thing that they, go on and on about.
So, you got to think about who you're thinking about. Who are they thinking for? So if you're a government, and this is the big thing that gets overlooked, people think that the health insurance has such control of the government because of the lobbying that they do. And they do have the most lobbying around. They spend the most on it. What people don't realize is that healthcare is a $3.5 trillion industry. And health insurance itself is a $715 billion industry. You're talking about some of the biggest companies in the country. And if you look at the actual, the largest portion of our budget right now, the U.S. budget is $3.3 trillion, of which we spend 4.4 because we don't hit budget. Obviously, if we don't have to, we print money. But 26% is healthcare, and Medicare is about 17% of that budget. And if you look at it, what Congress came up to as like the free market solution is they wanted the insurance companies go, hey, and this Slavic played a part with this too, but they're like, hey, we'll run your Medicare Advantage, and now the government doesn't have to pay for that. We'll run like a subset of Medicare, and we'll do it. And what the equivalent in the states is, the largest budget in every state in this country is Medicaid, and it is in Florida. Medicaid's a huge deal, and basically the insurers, if they've been privatized, your state has privatized Medicaid, The insurers run your legislator because they are the biggest portion of the budget of the legislature. So if you're Republican, you care about how much you're spending. If you're a Democrat, you care about access to care and getting these people seen. And, you know, and every state has to run, majority of them have to run a balanced budget. Florida certainly does. So they will basically bend over backwards to make the insurers happy in terms of cutting that. So from their standpoint, they go, we want to cut rates. The CBO says just as much. We need to cut rates in this, and this will save $29 billion. So if that's what makes them happy, Republicans will, you know, they're usually pretty fair about laissez-faire and let the market make the thing until it involves, you know, meeting the bottom line. Then all of a sudden they're happy to have a price control on there, you know. And then the other thing is too, which I think you alluded to, is the conflict of interest. Some of the biggest spokesmen for the insurer industry that seem that you know, the people who benefit benchmark and everything like that are people like, you know, you got the USC Public Policy, which is actually named after Lauren Schaefer, who actually ran WellPoint and was the CEO of WellPoint. So basically you have Lauren Adler, who's a big advocate for benchmark. Basically his school is funded by WellPoint, which is Anthem, which is one of the largest insurers in the country. And you also have what's called the NIHCM, which is basically a grant foundation funded by insurers who give grants to academics who happen to publish papers which say benchmarking is going to save us a lot of money. So it's no different than, you know, with Genentech and Altaplace saying, hey, TPA is amazing, we should give it to everybody. You know, well, you know, there's a little bit of conflict of interest there, and it's okay to have that, but nobody's declaring this. Like, you have to go hunting in these papers to find out where these grants came from. And you know, it's to me, it's no different than a pharma company sponsoring sponsoring a drug and doing a trial. And well, you know, it's sponsored by Merck. You gotta have a grain of salt with that, but there's no grain of salt with these. Congress takes these for gospel because you got people like Yale and USC and stuff like that coming up with these studies that show, hey, benchmarking is going to save money and it'll benefit consumers. And not only that, you have media is now getting grants. Like you have like Kaiser Health News is basically paid for partially by Blue Cross Blue Shield. So suddenly you get these stories in the media where like, you know, Granny went to the hospital and she got, you know, this huge balance bill for $50,000 from the ER. And then you actually go and read the article, and it was about 45,000 of that was from a helicopter ride that has nothing to do with the ER. And another 4,500 of that came from the actual hospital that was in her network, and that was actually her deductible. And then like 500 of that came from, you know, Team Health or Envision, which gets dragged across the mud for being private equity, even though, you know, United Health Group makes more than KKR and Blackstone combined in a year. So that's kind of where we are now. There's huge conflicts of interest that aren't really noted out there in the media.
Yeah.
That are being sponsored by healthcare companies.
Yeah, you know, conflicts of interest are hard because obviously everyone has conflict of interest, right? Physicians, you know, I mean, our conflict is that we want to be, you know, paid, you know, we want to be paid. And I think, you know, but I think that's why, but it's a very fair point because I think it needs to be raised when you have folks that take stances that are always on one side of things over and over again. And certainly needs to be made, just as you're saying, when they're kind of saying, hey, this is objective, scientific, you know, this is what the science says. And that's what they presented like to, you know, to ex-politician or whatnot. And it's not, and you know, when I wrote a piece in the healthcare blog called on surprise billing, probably, I don't know, 8 months ago or so, when something other than COVID mattered. And, you know, I noticed that in a piece by Zach Cooper about surprise billing, he did this paper that it wasn't a spectacular paper. He basically looked at two private equity firms and their practices to kind of show that they were maybe not acting in a good way in terms of raising rates. But a lot of what they showed was, you know, you can't tease out, it's hard to tease out what's really egregious and bad from, you know, a company coming in which has more leverage and trying to get more rates, maybe in ERs that are understaffed and are under market, right? The prices are under market. So, I mean, if a company comes in and tries to negotiate better, raise rates so they can staff better. I mean, that's kind of all. You couldn't tell from Zach Cooper's paper that this was definitely bad and egregious. But regardless, he presented the data as, showing prices go up once these larger firms come in. And because it's private equity, it's like, oh my God, this is, them kind of pillaging the US consumer. And then there was a section in there, because they had to mention it. The section there about New York's IDR, New York's Independent Dispute Resolution. And they noted the fact that the out-of-network rate went down a ton, 20% to 6%, right? But the way they kind of dismissed that was said this was administratively complex and potentially costly to run. And I just find that so incredibly disingenuous. It's the same people that talk about accountable care organizations that never mention the cost of actually setting up an ACO and following all these metrics and all this nonsense. They don't talk about the administrative cost of how much does it cost to run Nginx? I mean, how much was Andy Slavitt getting paid when he was CEO? I mean, that's all the cost of running these things, right? Those are not mentioned. But IDR, which is a one-page dispute resolution form, right? Patients had to know about and fill out a one-page form. That was, too costly and administratively complex. When you see stuff like that, you really, it really strikes you that there's got to be some really strong biases that are kind of at play here. David, what about this thing that is constantly said about private equity, right? Private equity has a reasonable presence in emergency medicine, I know. And, a lot of times this debate is cast as, COI on private equity's part, and saying, well, this is just private equity trying to raise their profits, right? So it's not even so much, there are enough economists we can find that'll say doctors are stuffing their pockets with, poor patients or something like that. But this gets to yet another level of it. Says it's not even doctors, it's private equity, these fat cats that are kind of getting rich. Your thoughts on private or your thoughts on this?
A good point. What was interesting is, like, when New York came up with their IDR, everybody was on board with it. Even Cooper, they supported it. Hey, this is not a bad solution. And then 2 years later, all of a sudden, hey, we got a better solution. It's called benchmarking. And Lauren Adler's kind of been the thing, and I actually have his paper right here. Interestingly enough, so we talked about the conflict of interest, KHN, which is Kaiser Health News, which is partially funded by an insurance company. Suddenly they said, when they tried to end surprise bills in New York, tied to arbitration, health costs went up. And what data did they give of it? They got a quote from Lauren Adler who says, this is extremely high and extremely inflationary. And basically what he based that on is basically, I have the thing here. He had a sample size of 402 of the cases. There's 1,000 cases, 600 were seen, right? And 402 of those, so 4 out of 6 cases, basically, the arbitrator, agreed that the physician was undercharged, basically, for the out-of-network rate. So he said this is inflationary because 2/3 of the cases were going in favor of the physician, which if you actually go back to tease the data from the beginning, it's actually not true. It's about 50-50. And the majority of these cases were, the number one field that used arbitration was plastic surgery. So somehow they tied that to the ER doctors, private equity are abusing this. And I'll remind you that there are 7 million ED visits alone in New York. This is a sample size of 402. That's not even including, your cardiology group goes there, or plastic surgeon, or an anesthesiologist. We're talking millions of cases with a sample size of 400. And just based on that, they did an entire article that says this is inflationary. And for his credit, I will say Zach Cooper had a tweet that said, I think this is being misrepresented, and this is not a very good article, basically. And that tweet suddenly disappeared, but the picture stays forever. I took a picture of it.
Oh, really?
And I'll even quote is like, I think the jury is still out. I think the law clearly shifted providers in network and protected fully insured patients. My work only shows 1 year post-implementation. The New York report doesn't have enough data to get an idea of what's really happened. That was his tweet. That tweet, I don't think no longer exists. But there's a huge conflict of interest here, and it has to do with, me personally, I tend to be cynical. I think a lot of these groups are funded with a lot of the insurance money to do this. It's like if me and you got
Yeah.
like a bunch of doctors together and we came up with a thing that says
Yeah.
that, insurers underpay doctors this much, and this is how much doctors should be paying. And we got economists from like Harvard to say, yeah, this is a great idea.
Yeah.
Kind of
yeah. I really think it has to do with, we had Josh Gottlieb on, a really nice guy, who came on to talk about a paper that they had written about physician income that somehow they got all our tax returns and cross-referenced, de-identified or whatever, cross-referenced it and came up with these numbers. And I really think it, they will never admit it, and Josh wouldn't admit it either. I think there's what they will say professionally, but I really think that the personal bias for most economists is, at least in this space, is that doctors make a ton of money and they shouldn't be complaining about things that'll give them a haircut, and I think that's where I really think that's where it comes from. I think if the average ER physician made $120,000 a year, I don't think you'd see any of this out there. I really don't. But because they feel our incomes are X times what it should be, I think you'll just keep seeing them coming up with solutions that will, by whatever way, by whatever empiric way, will reduce what the value of doctors are. So whether it be, attacking scope of practice, right? So, CRNAs can do what anesthesiologists do, reimburse them at a lower rate or whatnot, or whether it be, this kind of stuff, right? Where you have IDR that's working, but oh my God, now we have this other thing that we could plug in do some algorithm, and doctors will make even less. They're okay with that. So it's frustrating, but I mean, again, thanks to folks like you pulling back the veil. I mean, this rabbit hole of like Ingenix and Andy Slavitt and United Healthcare, and now what's now you have to know what the new version of Ingenix is, right? HCCI, which is the other insurer database. I think it's so important to kind of inform other physicians and also the wider public. Do you think politics? How should one play the politics of this? Meaning, this is not a political conversation that we're having right now, right? I mean, among physicians, I think there's widespread agreement that we'd like to be paid a reasonably fair rate, and we'd like to pay an ER physician who's highly trained, who literally saves your life. Try getting a plumber to come in emergently to fix a leak, and how much are you paying them? Meaning, some relative value system that kind of ensures that physicians are paid a commensurate amount, that you'll have really good people that are waiting for you at 2 a.m. when you need it the most. How should physicians kind of play the politics of this? Meaning, if they're in a Republican state, or if they're in a Republican locality or a Democrat locality, should they be saying different things, or how would you approach it?
I think they should. I think the biggest thing to consider, first off, physician compensation is about 8 to 20%, depending on who you listen to. We had physician services, I think it goes up to 20% of all health care costs in the U.S. If you paid every single physician in the U.S. nothing, you'd only cut healthcare costs by 8%. We spend administrative costs, which is the cost of me submitting my claim to your insurance, to have my billing company to go to the insurance, to go back, to go to the patient, to go back, is 33 to 36% of the cost in that. So to put that in perspective, we spend more on basically paying the bill for medicine than actually having doctors get paid for doing the medicine, which is insane. And the reason that is because Congress created all these little silos that make money. And if you talk about the biggest example I can give of this is called GPO, and basically they're a $4 billion a year industry, a group purchase organizer. They're basically a secondary middleman who just connects hospitals to PBMs. They do nothing. They add no value at all. And Congress actually made a law, I think it was in 2000, where basically they can give a kickback to the hospitals. So hospitals use them because they get a kickback, and the kickback is legal. Kickbacks are illegal. It's racketeering,
Right.
basically.
Right.
So Congress really created this mess. So Congress is going to have to get us out of this mess. So you're absolutely right. There's different arguments you can make. I mean, and I'm on this side. I tend to be agnostic when I advocate. I'm not Republican. I'm not Democrat. I try to do I think what's best for patients and what's best for physicians as a whole. I mean, if you're a Republican and you believe in free market, a benchmark is a price control. Lo and behold, price controls create price ceilings. It's going to lead to a shortage. You already see it in California. They have a huge shortage because Medi-Cal pays nothing in California. And California has one of the worst prices. That's why they're trying to pass nurse practitioners to do everything, put burr holes in patients at the bedside. I have no idea, because they're in a rut because nobody wants to go to California and pay 40% tax, 50% tax, and then you get paid less than you get paid in Mississippi, which the cost of living is about half of California, right? So I think from a Republican standpoint, I think true, to be true, like some Republican and think tanks have called them out on this. Benchmark is, lo and behold, it's a price control. So, you got Senator Alexander who's retiring, but it's like you're initiating a price control. And some commercials actually called him out for doing that, So that's a big issue. If you're talking to Democrats and stuff like that, I think, we talk about shortages. If you're in a rural or urban hospital, your ER is what keeps that whole entire city or rural area running. Because I practiced out in Roxborough, North Carolina, middle of nowhere, and I was the only doctor awake at night in that whole entire place when I worked there. If anybody has an emergency, you're keeping them up. What people don't realize is most ER doctors see about 20% of what we see are uninsured. We don't get reimbursed anything on that. We see about $200,000 in unreimbursed care a year is how much we see. We make $200,000 more if everybody paid us what we build or whatever like that. Well, we don't. And, for the most part, I'm not saying I'm not asking for more money or anything like that, but I'm asking, please don't cut my salary 20% when we see more unfunded care than anybody else in the world in the United States. And when you talk to Democrats, if you do this, you're going to have huge shortages in rural areas. It's going to hit these hospitals hard. These hospitals are not going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to staff their hospitals. If you live in one of these rural areas and God forbid you're in a serious accident or you have a heart attack or you have a stroke, who's going to be seeing these patients? Who's going to be able to take care of it? I mean, it's to the point where some places in South Dakota have telemedicine doctors with PAs and nurse practitioners who have never intubated, are intubating people with the telemedicine doctor telling them how to intubate. I mean, I don't want that for my family. I don't want that. I don't think it's the best interest of Americans. So, you have to kind of balance this, in terms of, I know insurers run a big portion of our budget, but really if you completely cut doctors' salaries 20%, you're going to have a shortage. It's going to affect the rural and the urban, safety net hospitals the most. And I think that resonates on both sides, especially Democrat. If you want to talk about, getting people the care they need, this is really going to hurt them. So it hits both ways. There's more fair ways to do this. And here's the thing: if New York and Texas came up with similar solutions, these are very different states. Red state, blue state, and they both work. And we're arguing, hey man, copy what Georgia just came up with, a great one. Similar. It balances between Texas and New York. Saying, look at what this state did. This state did. These are not a blue solution, red solution. These are solutions that are fair. They're fair to patients, and they're relatively fair to us who are smaller groups than insurances. But there's still a lot of momentum to fight because of what a big part insurers pay in the budget for the United States.
Yeah, no question. I think the middleman problem in the U.S. is just such a huge problem, and how exactly to fix that is hard. But I think they're honestly, the middlemen are making a mistake by coming after doctors because, at the end of the day, physicians you've kind of built capital based on being available for patients, based on, doing what, you do for patients, so, I think they're desperate. I think they're making a mistake by kind of trying to paint physicians as the bad guy, because it may work in academic economist or whatever. Sorry. I mean, I don't mean to bust on economists too hard, but it may work in certain corners of Twitter or whatnot. But I don't think it's a message that that sells overall. So, Damian, I mean, it's just I'm amazed by how much you've kind of dug into it, and it's really awesome. So, and you're a fantastic follow on Twitter. What your Twitter handle is?
I think it's 813 Jafford at 813 Jafford.
It is at 813 Jafford. Exactly. I won't ask you to say what the acronym is.
Yeah.
I'll leave it to them to figure out. All right. Well, Damian, thanks so much for coming on. Your time's super important. I really appreciate you spending the time with us.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All righty.